Welcome. My name is Chezzy Miltner. I'm the Executive Director at the Galiano Conservancy. And I have the pleasure today of hosting a talk by two people I have a lot of respect for. Nikki Wright, who's the Executive Director of the SeaChange Marine Conservation Society, and Rob Underhill, who's the staff biologist at the Mayne Island Conservancy Society. And so they're going to be doing more or less two separate talks. Nikki will be speaking first, and Rob will be speaking after. And we'll have a chance to do questions after each talk. So if you can post your questions into the chat at the bottom, that will be the simplest way. And then when each talk finishes, we'll have a period to bring up those questions. And I'll say the question, but if you want, I'll also give you a chance to reiterate the question or rephrase the question if you'd like. And then the speaker can answer them. During the talk, if you can keep yourself muted and turn off your video, it'll save your own bandwidth, and also then make it clear that the speaker's video will be more highlighted. So again, our first speaker today is Nikki Wright, who's not only the Executive Director at SeaChange, the Marine Conservation Society, but is also the co-chair of the Eelgrass Conservation Working Group, and she has a long history with the Galiano Conservancy, and I'll let her speak to that further. So without further ado, thank you, Nikki, for joining us, and I'll remove my pin and see if I can pin your screen. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I start my slideshow, I just want to say that I'm very grateful to be a part of this community. I'm sitting in my home in Brentwood Bay in the unceded territory of the Westanic people. And I was thinking earlier on a walk this morning, how many wonderful, brilliant people are part of this community, this environmental community. And I feel extremely privileged to be working with all of you. Those of you who are new to the movement and those of you who've been in it for a very, very long time. I don't think about that so much because we're so busy doing the work together, but I wanted to voice my appreciation. And I just also want to just give a small introduction in terms of working with the Galiano Conservancy Association goes back to when we were first starting the environmental education program there. And I would get on the 5:15 a.m. ferry thinking, I have no time. I can't do this. I can't take a day out of my work schedule. And this was back in, what, 2000 or something. But at the end of the day, I was so very glad I did it. And with Keith Erickson and Kate Emmings and Ken Millard, we crafted together the beginnings of a really now robust and beautiful and extensive environmental education program. So I just want to say how much I appreciate the Conservancy for being there, for saving the lands, for creating the Learning Center, and for being such a steady ship in such rocky times. So I guess without too much ado, I'm going to start on a PowerPoint, and we'll hope that everything goes smoothly. You never know, but we shall see. There we go. How nice of it. I think it cooperated. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking to the matters of eelgrass, but I want to make it clear, I'm just putting myself on a timer. I want to make it clear that it's all part of a system. Okay. Let's see what happened here. Seems to be frozen.
Nikki, click on the image first and then you can advance, I think.
Okay, that would be helpful. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, for a few minutes, I'll be speaking about eelgrass, that wonderful plant that makes many of us happy when we're on a boat mapping it or restoring it. But I just want to put it in the context of the whole nearshore system that some might think of as beginning with the kelp in deeper waters. If you think of the migration in reverse of salmon, from, let's say it's returning to its natal stream, it'll come into the kelp forest and then slowly meander into the eelgrass and up through the freshwater system. And as it needs to adjust from saltwater to freshwater, the eelgrass beds provide shelter and a refugia and food while that is happening. So I love this graphic done by two wonderful people on Gabriola, LJ Kelly and Cameron. And it is a really good picture of how the system works in a rather artistic way. So we have the kelp and the eelgrass. You come into shallower and to the shore where you have your forage fish spawning area, your cockles, the crabs, the clams that were harvested for so many thousands of years here, the sand lance, the surf smelt, and then all the way up through the logs into the coastal forest. So when I talk about eelgrass, it's in the context of a very alive system, and keeping the whole system alive is what the primary purpose of all of our work that we do collectively. When I say that in this context, I'm talking about the Galiano Conservancy and the Mayne Island Conservancy Society with Rob. We had an interest in eelgrass when we were doing some presentations on Thetis Island way back when, the very beginning days, 21, 22 years ago. And here we have Trish Farrell, who was raised as First Nations in Deep Bay. And on the left, you can see her speaking to high school students on Thetis Island as part of the Leadership for Earth group that we slowly robbed enough time from a show and tell time to a day of education of high school students who would come on motor vessels and sailing boats from Vancouver and the rest of Canada to spend a week in the Gulf Islands, learning everything from nearshore habitats to sustainable fisheries to First Nations cultural practices and sustainable forestry, and on and on and on. It was an incredibly wonderful program. So part of that program, Trish was standing on the shore, speaking of being a young child and watching the herring come into Deep Bay so thick that it looked like she could walk on it. And they would put, she's holding cedar boughs, but I suspect they would put in hemlock boughs into the shallow waters, and the herring would come and lay their eggs on it. And then they'd collect the boughs and put them in a bin. And she would sneak behind grandmother, who had eyes on the back of her head, and try to swipe some of the herring roe or eggs off the branches. And without turning her head, the grandmother would say, "And what are you doing?" And Trish had her mouth and cheeks full of roe, and she could hardly mumble out, "Nothing, Grandma." And without turning her head again, grandmother said, "And is it good?" And Trish said, "It's wonderful," with a full mouth. That story captured my imagination, because for years I had been going to DFO meetings and all kinds of conferences on the concept of a sustainable yield. In other words, how much could we take from the ocean without crashing the product? In this terms, it was mostly salmon. And I got so cynical that I just could not bear to hear that word anymore, sustainability or yield. And I started to think, as part of a conservation organization and part of the movement, how could we give back to the ocean? And it turned out it was Trish's talk that started the ball rolling on thinking about a nearshore plant that had so much value to both the marine life and to us that we could actually bring back into the ocean where it was damaged. So she, to me, was the inspiration for the work that I'll be describing. So to First Nations, there's all kinds of functions and wonderful purpose to the plant. This is what it looks like, and from all the way from the seeds to the rhizomes to the leaves themselves, there was always a function, and they were used extensively for many, like cooking insulation, insulation for their housing food ceremonial purposes, cooking insulation, all that. It really useful plant. And this is what herring roe looked many years ago. Of course, we all know that herring will lay their eggs on anything. But if eelgrass is present in the nearshore, that's where they will lay their eggs. And then the eelgrass or the kelp can be harvested. This is a picture of eelgrass because many times in the very beginning days of education, when I thought everybody knew about it because I was so enthusiastic about this plant. Once I started diving in it and thinking about restoration and actually doing the restoration, I call it my happy plant. So I thought everybody in the world knew about it. And I remember being up in Alert Bay, giving a pretty long lecture, and I was nervous as anything. I was new to it. And finally, somebody at the end of the talk came up to me and said, it would be great if you would show a picture of it. So I learned my lesson. Many people are still not aware of what this plant looks like. It's considered a salmon highway, and that's how it's referred to in Puget Sound. It looks like this when it's uprooted by storms or by geese, and it grows primarily through rhizomatic action. So it's a clonal plant. This is the rhizome right here, if you can see my little doohickey, and then roots stabilize it into the substrate, and then you have shoots coming off of those nodes where the roots are. So one plant, such as this one, can give rise to thousands of other plants by this kind of propagation. So it's a clonal plant, and one plant can actually create a meadow if the conditions are right. And we'll go into that in a moment. The other way that it propagates is through seed. And around this time of year, to about June or July in this part of the Salish Sea, you can see these little grains of what look like wheat. And they come off a shoot that separates itself from the main plant. That shoot has to pollinate on the surface of the water and then sink in the right substrate, which is usually muddy sand. So you can see it's tricky business. And the only places that I've seen robust seeding is when a bed is very crowded and dense, and there is no room for the rhizomes or the underground stems to expand. That's where I've seen the most seeding plants. Now, some of you might say, oh, I've seen this plant. I've been to Parksville, I've been to Qualicum, I've been to Boundary Bay. And at low tide, I've seen it all over the place. Yes, that's eelgrass, but it's called Japanese eelgrass, and it is an exotic. In this part of the world, we don't consider it an invasive because it does not compete for the same space as the native eelgrass, marina. And the way you can tell, it's just a very speedy little lecture about this. This is what the Japanese eelgrass looks like. It's less wide, it's a rather narrow blade, and it has a little membrane, a little transparent membrane that holds the two sheaths of the shoot together. And when you pull those two blades apart, you will find that it just slips off. It doesn't tear. It's a kind of a flap, overlapping flap. And if you're very carefully observant of when you tear that, it won't be tearing, it will be just separating. Whereas with the native eelgrass, it will actually rip. So here's a picture of Zostera marina when it rips, when you pull those two sheaths apart. It's tricky business. You kind of have to do it several times to find out. But for the most part, the take-home message is Japanese eelgrass grows for the most part annually in the intertidal zone. And the eelgrass I'm talking about today is the native eelgrass that grows in the shallow subtidal to approximately, in this part of the world, -7 meters is the average. So this is how they serve as salmon highways. They function as nurseries to provide food for approximately 80% of commercially important fish species during some part of their life cycle. And they serve as a refugia from predators and waves. Here's a kind of complicated picture of that. It's kind of the wordy version of that artistic depiction that I was first started this talk on about the living system. So you have the back shore here, which in an urban environment, if these trees and shrubs are intact, they help filter the pollutants and sediments that are coming towards the beach, slow down the sediments, absorb torrential rainfall, and provide shade for the forage fish, which are sand lance and surf smelt, which is the very bottom of the food chain for everything up above it. So those fish spawn, surf smelt spawn all year round, and the sand lance in this part of the Salish Sea from about November to February. Then you have the drift logs creating stability. So when the waves are coming, it helps break the waves before they reach the back shore, and the habitat for intertidal life. And then the eelgrass provides oxygen, stores carbon, which is often considered blue carbon, and slows erosion, and provides habitat for salmon and so many other species of marine life. So here's just some pictures of it being served as a nursery. And when Cynthia Durant, who actually started helping us along this path of mapping and restoring eelgrass back in 1998, she and I had the privilege of going up the coast as far as Haida Gwaii and the central coast, and we covered Kitimat and went over to Haida Gwaii itself. And we went all over the place with kind of the emerald keys of the city. It was a really privileged position to be in because we weren't tourists. We were coming in to talk about eelgrass and mapping it because there wasn't the resources available to do a recent map of the habitat for the whole coast. So we thought the best way to do it was to train people to map it locally. And so we were on the central coast, and we were talking to the guardians, and they were kind of falling asleep because we were inside under fluorescent lights. And I was thinking, how can we make this engaged conversation? Because they weren't on the boat. And so I said, tell me where you got your crabs. Where traditionally would you harvest your crabs? Oh, you mean the crabgrass, not the eelgrass. And that is so much more of an appropriate name for it because that's where all the juvenile crab will hang out. It's just a little artistic depiction again of everything from the tiny, tiny, tiny little microorganisms and microalgae that grow on the blades and make use of it for food and a sheltering place. And all the things that live on the eelgrass, that live amongst it, and the ducks and the birds as well, all the way up to the wonderful humpbacks. So it does provide so much, and it's valued sparingly, is what I would call. Many people are not aware of it. And if they are, sometimes it's considered a nuisance because it does grow in the muddy subtidal areas where people like to anchor and come in with their kayaks. And it's kind of considered a nuisance when it gets caught in your prop as you're leaving your boat in your little skiff. So I'm always amazed how it would take a lot of talks to get to everybody. So the things I guess I'm suggesting is that when you learn something about this plant and then you come across it, or you probably, most of you are already familiar with it, spread the word. This is the general distribution of this particular eelgrass. And the darker lines over here are the areas where eelgrass was affected in the 1930s from a wasting disease, which we are noticing more prevalent now in eelgrass beds. I'm not as concerned as I would have been if I lived in the 30s at this point. But it does seem to be temperature related. So as our waters warm up, especially sea surface temperatures warm up, the fungus, which is what it is, seems to like warmer water. So it's always there, but it seems to take over beds as the water temperature rises. So it is a concern during time of climate change to observe how this slime mold, I will call it, is increasing in beds. And this is your precious island. This was mapped in 2013 for the Islands Trust. And so on the eastern side, you can see these areas here. The red are the continuous beds. Continuous means that they are flat and they're dense. And this was in 2013. It would be wonderful to look at them again, 2021, 22, to see what kind of changes are going on because of climate changes as well as human impacts. And this is on the North Island. So you can see that most of the beds are in the southeast area. Now we're going to talk a little bit about climate changes. And I kind of call this the 3 R's. Just checking my time. Okay. Relinquishment, resiliency, and restoration. And the first one, of course, is where are those vulnerable spots that it might be affected by sea level rise? Most estuaries are very vulnerable. The yellow here, the whole coast has been mapped or can be mapped, and you can check it out on Google under sea level rise with the province of, the environmental, Ministry of Environment has figured out a way to map the vulnerable areas of shorelines all along the coast. And here Galiano is. The red would be the most vulnerable and the yellow, the second most vulnerable. And so those areas in the eelgrass are mostly vulnerable, but that's not a surprise because as I said, eelgrass likes sandy mud and those are very susceptible to erosion. So we need to be mindful of what can we do to increase resiliency to wave action and sea level rise. And this is one way that people have reacted is by building seawalls and building their structures way too close to a very active wave energy that's increasing yearly. So it's not the best solution. And this was a picture that we took of a property in Howe Sound to show if we're taking a systems approach to a healthy ecosystem, then this is the exact opposite of maintaining that health. They take off the back shore and increase the flow coming down from the land to increase the sediment and whatever else would be coming down with that sediment, maybe contaminants, into these shallow bays. And people are doing this all the time because they want to develop near the nearshore and they also want their views. So I guess I lost that picture, but it's basically we need to move back. And if we don't move back, then what are some of the solutions that we can provide in the interim? I think climate change is here to stay. So any solution, whether it's beach enrichment or putting more logs on the water or changing the grade of a beach, are temporary solutions. And the best solution in my mind is the concept of moving back. I wanted to show this picture because of eelgrass creating a mat in the sediment that decreases wave action just as much as the kelp does. I've lost a few slides there, which is too bad, but kelp slows down wave action, and then as the waves come in, the eelgrass also takes some of that wave energy off. And we need to make sure that there's room on the shore as sea level rise increases that the eelgrass and eventually the kelp, if it has a chance, can move shoreward. This is a picture of the boat impacts in Australia, but it happens everywhere in the Gulf Islands, where there's scouring of the seabed because of the anchor chains attached to the mooring buoys. And this is what it does underwater. So the more that you make those breaks in an eelgrass bed, you're discontinuing that salmon highway. And it's just as if somebody from Squamish was trying to get to Vancouver, and you had about 600 or 700 different landslides happening all along the highway, and you can't get to Vancouver. That's kind of like what boat anchoring does for many, many marine critters. It fragments a continuous bed, and after a while, the bed will die. This is a solution. It's something we've tried in Mannion Bay, in Howe Sound, and also in Ford Cove on Hornby Island. It's called a midline mooring system, and basically does away with the chain dragging on the seabed and elevates a rope that goes all the way up to the mooring buoy with 2 midline floats. And they're doing very well. We've been monitoring them, watching the eelgrass expand closer to the mooring block. If somebody does have to, or has already decided to be in eelgrass beds, this is a way to mitigate damage done by chains attached to the mooring block. This is another thing that we're trying to adopt. Again, in our first one will be in Mannion Bay and Howe Sound. And there's a series of marker buoys protecting an eelgrass bed. And this is in Port Townsend. It's happened over at least a decade, and it's been very, very successful. It is a voluntary system, but just like with seat belts, who would be driving now without a seatbelt? We're hoping eventually boaters would notice that there's eelgrass, or be educated about eelgrass and see one of these signs, either in Puget Sound or in Canada, and say, oh, of course, I won't be mooring there or anchoring there for the day. So we're starting our first one this month or next month in Mannion Bay off of Bowen Island. Log booming industry has done an enormous impact on the whole entire coast because those logs there, the longer they sit in an area, in an estuary, the more the seabed is affected biologically, chemically, or physically because of the woody debris that is shed from those logs and affects the health of the marine ecosystem on the seabed. So eventually, if they're there long enough, the most sophisticated marine life you'll find on a seabed for over 100 years will be worms. So those are the places that we decide need help. So when we're doing restoration, we're looking at former log booming areas primarily and seeing where we can restore them because it has such a big impact on all of the coast. We're working away at it. We have about 33 sites, a little more than 33 sites in Howe Sound, Burrard Inlet, Seashelt Inlet, and the Gulf Islands. We plant according to a pattern of about a meter apart. They're planted in groups of 10 along a transect line so that we can monitor them over time, 6 months after restoration and 6 months following that first monitoring for 5 years. We look at shoot densities. I don't think I have enough time, unfortunately, to show this. I'd much rather talk to you and answer any questions or comments that you have. But this is can be found on our website at SeaChangeSociety.com, and you can find this under restoration. It's just a video of our restoration methods.
How long is the video, Nikki?
Sorry?
How long is the video?
It's 6 minutes.
Okay, it's 2:32. So depending how much more time you have, we're doing fairly well on time.
Do you want me to try to see if it works?
You can if you're interested.
All right, if it's too jerky, we'll stop too. Okay, thank you. This is Cowichan Estuary.
Nikki, is there sound on your video?
Yeah, you can't hear it.
No, you may have to share the audio.
Got it. It's only music. It's
Okay.
so it's okay if you don't.
And we can probably do without it. Apparently you have to do it before sharing your screen.
Okay.
Where is the bay we're looking at right now, Nikki?
Sorry?
Where is the bay that we're looking at right now?
It's a Cowichan Estuary,
Okay.
Duncan. So this was about 2016. And Genoa Bay is just off of the Cowichan Estuary in Cowichan Bay. We could not do this work without community support. The donor plants were taken with permission from Cowichan tribes in that area there. Eelgrass grows about a half a meter per year, and we're very careful when we harvest it that we don't pick from one area alone. We dive through the area and pick selectively so that the air can fill in within a few months' time. The best thing to do is to harvest as close to the transplant site as possible so that the conditions are similar from the native bed to the transplant site. Same depth, water quality, sediment, all those things. If they're as similar as possible, then you know the failure would not be because we chose plants from the wrong site. So there's our transect, and we use really sophisticated equipment, as you can tell. So the people on the shore, the volunteers, attached each eelgrass shoot to an ungalvanized steel washer. Those are gathered up in groups of 10 and planted into the substrate. The washers are used to anchor the plant so that when waves and boat wash disrupt the waters, the eelgrass won't wash away. We've also noticed that because the washers are ungalvanized, they rust in the salt water. And because there's a lot of hydrogen sulfides in former log booming areas caused by the woody debris, the rust from the steel washer will combine with those hydrogen sulfides and create a small area where it's allowed more oxygen. Over time, the washers do degrade, as well as the twist ties. Twist ties degrade very quickly. You can see how unconsolidated or murky the water becomes from the very loose sediment, and that's caused by log booms. Thank you for your patience with that. You couldn't hear it. And then, as I said, we monitor and we use data loggers to look at temperature and light penetration. We also do some debris removal, as there's so much debris in so many of these bays and estuaries. This is a fishing net that was abandoned in Porpoise Bay on Seashell Inlet. This is the kind of damage it will do. We do a lot of eelgrass signage, and your island is going to be doing signage of its own. So it's going to be quite wonderful because you're going to have very specific maps because of all the work that Rob and the volunteers have been doing. So to us, it doesn't matter which eelgrass signage is up, as long as the public is getting more and more educated, and they'll become so familiar with eelgrass, it'll be like strapping your seatbelt on. Of course you wouldn't anchor in eelgrass. Of course you wouldn't. Who'd do that? Here's some of the information that might be helpful for you. You don't have to copy down the websites. It's just, you can look at the Islands Trust eelgrass maps for Galiano and all the other islands within the Islands Trust area. The Seagrass Conservation Working Group has some information there, and also our website. And I want to thank these wonderful people who've given their time to video, take pictures, give us the research, all the various contributions that make our work possible. And there you go.
Thank you so much, Nikki. We have a variety of questions, so I'll start to present those. And if the people, once I've presented your question, if I've presented it false, or if you have a follow-up question, please unmute yourself. But going back up, someone asked whether eelgrass is the grass that grizzly bears like to eat. I feel like someone else also answered that that might be a different Lingby sedge instead of eelgrass, but I don't know if you're familiar.
Yeah, on the Central Coast and further north, I have seen pictures of wolves, and I have heard about bears harvesting plants as well as the animals that live in them, waiting for the salmon. So it's kind of the plant that's in the waiting room while the salmon are about to run.
And that question was from Georgia, and then Anine Vonkeman asked, how resilient is eelgrass?
Resilient to
disturbance, I would suppose. I'm not sure. Anine, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to clarify that question. Maybe in the interim, we'll go on to a different question.
Hi.
Oh, go ahead, Anine.
Go ahead.
Hi, Nikki. Thanks very much. I guess resilient to damage done to it. Does it, like if patches are removed by anchors, how long does it take for it to grow back if the anchor is placed somewhere else?
Great. It takes about a half a meter a year of growth to fill in. So it is resilient, but as I said, the more boats that come in, and COVID has brought in more and more and more and more boats into estuaries and quiet bays. People are trying to escape the land for good reason, because it's so bloody boring, right? And so we get on our boats and we live the dream, but we're crowding the near shores to the extent that all those different accumulative effects, all those 1,000 cuts, eventually will destroy the bed and it won't have a chance to recover. And so I'm feeling like this part of the Salish Sea is about at the tipping point, that if we don't start educating ourselves and changing our behavior, we will lose our beds to the extent that England has. There was a report recently put out. They have lost 90% of their seagrasses. We could get to that point with climate change and our human behavior combined. We could see the loss of a really, really vital system. We are losing our kelp because of climate change. We could be losing our eelgrass.
Thank you. And another question from Chiara. Before I actually move on to the other questions, for those that joined us late, I just wanted to say also, we do have a second speaker, Rob Underhill. So we'll go through these questions quickly, and then we'll have another presentation. So from Chiara, how can an individual help to conserve and protect these areas?
So we have signage, we have talks, we have a different kind of mooring system that would not damage the eelgrass beds except for the moorage block. Education, 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 education. Water quality is really important, so not dumping out gray and black water in areas that are low circulation. Yeah, those are the things I talked about. We really do need to talk to each other. Boaters need to talk to each other. Shoreline residents need to talk to each other. There's only so many of us in the environmental movement. We're hoping that talks like these will be like a virus, but a positive one, where everybody will say, oh, look at that. I know a little bit about that. This is how we can protect it. Because I think that's the only way that we're going to be able to reverse this damage that's happening.
Thank you. And Jen McInnes asked about the methodology used to survey and map existing eelgrass beds and where she can find out more information. I believe Rob might talk a little bit about the methodology that we've used more recently. So that may be answered in his presentation. Rob, can you confirm that?
Super. That's great.
Yeah, you know, what would be great though, Nikki, is if you could give a very brief summary of the methods that were used during the presence absence mapping that SeaChange did for Islands Trust Conservancy, because I'm going to be mentioning it, but I hadn't intended to describe those methods within my presentation.
Great. So basically, we have a boat with an underwater camera, and we have somebody on the boat looking at a screen, and the underwater camera is picking up the presence of eelgrass. And what we try to do is look at the edges. So we look at the deeper edge and say if it's 1 shoot per meter square or more, that is the edge. And then we try to determine the shoreward edge, and we make rather subjective judgments about the density and the distribution of the eelgrass. But Rob has a much more intense and diligent way of really looking in detail. So what we could afford to do with all 13 islands and Islands Trust was to map presence or absence of eelgrass. And then if development was going to happen, it would have to be examined more closely to see if damage was going to be done by development.
Thank you. And Lori has a question about funding, whether you're receiving any from the provincial and federal governments. I'll just say briefly that the mapping that Rob will present on shortly, funding was provided for that by Fisheries and Oceans Canada through the Habitat Stewardship Program. But perhaps you can speak to your own.
Yeah, we were able to receive a coastal restoration fund under the Oceans Protection Act in 2017. So we did garbage removals and eelgrass restoration. We have 1 more year to go, and marine riparian restoration till 2022. But we've been getting mostly federal money and some from foundations since we started in 2000.
Great. And Julie Gardner asks about golf balls and whether they're fairly inert in eelgrass beds or whether they can have an impact.
That's a great question, Julie. I don't like people doing it, but I don't think it's got that much impact. Not on the plant, it may have on the crabs.
Then it's not a battle to pick with my neighbor. Stick
Well,
to the
I've made comments to people at Island View Beach about doing that. It's just disrespectful. That's what it is. But as far as physical, chemical, biological impact, no. It's just disrespectful. Anything that doesn't belong in the ocean shouldn't be there.
Thank
Certainly
you.
a better fight to pick is if they have a boat moored and a chain that doesn't have a midline buoy. And Jan really more of a statement than a question, but says that it would be great to do talks with boating clubs. So I guess the question is, have you done any talks with boating clubs, and has there been any uptake?
Yes, in the mood that I'm in, I think that boating clubs are really good, and so many boaters want to do the right thing. And if we as conservancies shared, I'd be happy to share everything I have as far as PowerPoints. You can modernize them, make them really sexy. Let's share resources and get to as many people as possible. I'm really feeling, especially lately after I read the article from the UK, we don't have much time to waste. You know, this could be a leisurely thing. Oh yeah, in 20 years, we'll do much better. But with climate changes and our overpopulation on the coast, we don't have a lot of time. So let's share resources and get those talks out there to as many boaters and residents as possible.
Thank you. So yeah, Jen Worley and anyone else who might have a connection to a boating club, please do reach out either to SeaChange or Mayne Island Conservancy or the Galiano Conservancy. And we can either set up a presentation or at least give you those resources so you can present it to your members. Yeah. If anyone else has questions, please add it to the chat. And if not, then we're going to move on to our next presentation. And if you have questions, there'll be another question period at the end of Rob's talk. So our next presenter is Rob Underhill, who's the staff biologist at Mayne Island Conservancy Society, and he MIC's Mayne Island Conservancy Society has been the Galiano Conservancy's partner these past 2 years on the cetacean conservation project, which is funded by Fisheries and Oceans Canada through the Habitat Stewardship Program, and is a has done a lot of mapping of both eelgrass habitats as well as kelp beds, in addition to outreach on cetaceans and the various impacts that they're battling in the Sailor Sea. So I'm going to pass it over to Rob and mute myself again so you won't hear the baby in the background too much.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm just going to get my slideshow started up here. If I can. So I'm joining you guys from my home in Village Bay on Mayne Island. And I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you guys today about eelgrass. And it's great to be doing a presentation with Nikki as well. She was one of the first people that I was able to work with eelgrass early on. Her and I did a lot of the mapping around Thetis Island together in a boat. She managed not to throw me overboard, so thank you, Nikki, for not doing that. She was talking about the methods that were used with the drop camera and the boat during that, and I have a couple pictures I just quickly threw in to give a visual of that. So this is a picture of Leanna Boyer, who was instrumental in developing the marine programs, the marine monitoring programs for the Mayne Island Conservancy. She was our executive director until around 2013, maybe. Anyway, her and I did a lot of the survey work for that that drop camera survey that Nikki was talking about. So you got one person in the front of the boat there staring into this tiny little screen and maneuvering the camera, which is on a spool hooked up to this pelican case, and then trying not to get seasick. And then you've got the other surveyor in the back taking waypoints, and they're just talking to each other back and forth the whole time. So that was my first exposure to working with eelgrass, and I thank Nikki and Leanna for the mentorship that they've provided me in that early time. So my 4 goals as part of this presentation are, first, something that I've really realized in the last 2 years since I've started doing more free diving associated with these eelgrass surveys, is how accessible and amazing our nearshore environments are. You don't need expensive scuba gear or training or experience to get out there and experience these ecosystems for yourself. And so I strongly encourage you to invest the small amount of money that you need for a mask and snorkel and flippers. And if you want to stay out there longer or be out there during colder weather, a wetsuit is going to make you much more comfortable. But these places are right in our backyard, and so I really hope that you can get out there. I had planned on showing a whole bunch of videos today to also try and inspire you to get out there, but I'm going to scale back the number of videos I do, just because I noticed they were a little bit chunky when we tested them out earlier today. Secondly, I want to inspire you guys to take stewardship over our nearshore environments. Nikki touched on this, and she helps to inspire me to feel this way. But I think that we shouldn't lay back and assume that some government organization or other organization is going to take responsibility and do the right thing on our behalf to maintain these important ecosystems. I think that's something that we can all share the responsibility for, and I encourage you to adopt that mindset. And I appreciate that you guys are here as part of this presentation, because I think that that's one of the first steps. I have two programs that I want to share information about. One is the eelgrass monitoring and mapping work that's been done by the Mayne Island Conservancy around Mayne Island between 2019 and the present. And then the work that we've been doing in collaboration with the Galiano Conservancy over the last 2 years. So let's get into it. And so I've got a couple slides here to inspire you in lieu of the videos that I've just quickly switched some of them out. So when the visibility is nice, eelgrass ecosystems are an amazing place to dive and snorkel recreationally. They're full of life and there's so much to see. And so I really encourage you to get out there and do that. So I'll start off with the mapping work that's been done around the Mayne Island coastline. And so this work goes back to 2009, which was before my time here at the Conservancy. This was done under the leadership of Leanna Boyer, with lots of input from other regional eelgrass enthusiasts and mappers like Nikki. And we had resources at that time to map the full extent of all the eelgrass beds around Mayne Island. And then from that, 3 sites were chosen to monitor repeatedly, one bay each year on a 3-year rotation to detect changes in extent. And so those 3 locations were Miners Bay, Gallagher Bay, and Horton Bay. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've seen in Miners Bay and Gallagher Bay. We haven't seen too much change in Horton Bay. So I'm just going to focus on those 2 sites. So I'll start with Miners Bay. So I have 2, so I should mention that this monitoring work has been done in large part thanks to volunteer freedivers from the Vancouver Freediving Club, who, with the exception of last year because of COVID, were coming over for a weekend every summer. They would come and we would put them up and feed them, and they would put in 2 solid days of mapping work under the water in partnership with us and our staff and volunteers who would be in the kayaks. And I'll talk a little bit more about the methodology that we use in detail as we go through. But that's been a really successful and amazing partnership for us. And one of the things that I would love to see in the coming years is, I'd love to continue our partnership with the Vancouver Freediving Club, but I would also love to see an increase in the number of volunteers that we utilize for that purpose who live locally within the islands, because I think it's a very powerful thing to be physically present in the ecosystems that we're talking about. So Miners Bay in 2009, these maps were created by having the freedivers dive down to the edge of the beds, popping back up to the surface and communicating to a surveyor in the kayak where to record waypoints with a GPS. What you end up with is kind of like a connect the dots. You go back to the computer after the field surveys and draw these polygons by connecting the dots together to form the shapes of where the eelgrass. In 2000, I'm going to show you the next slide. I want you to look at this area of the map because that's where we see a lot of loss. So in 2017, when we repeated the surveys, we noticed that we had lost a really big chunk of eelgrass just north and east of the Miners Bay dock. And we also have video transects. So that area that we're talking about is right here. And fortunately, we had these video transects that have been repeated each time we do the survey. We had one located right in that place. And so when we noticed that that area had been lost, the first thing I did is went back and looked at those videos and to see, how dense was that eelgrass in that area before that loss. And it was actually a very beautiful, big, dense bed. So it was not an insignificant loss, and it's not an insignificant area. This is about 50 meters across by maybe 35 meters. So it's a pretty big area of loss there. In terms of why that happened, my leading theory for this specific location as to why that was lost is in Miners Bay along the shoreline here, there is a protrusion of shale as the bedrock. And that shale formation extends out into the ocean here. And I think what happened is that in this location, the sediments, the sand and mud that had accumulated over top of that shale formation was quite thin. And so that during a low tide, either storm activity or possibly wake, was, you know, as you guys know, Active Pass is a pretty busy route for shipping, especially the BC ferries. So either wake or storm washed out that sediment in this location. That's the leading theory for that spot. So this is Gallagher Bay on the south side of Mayne Island. And this is the mapping that was done in 2009, 2013. And I want you to look at this one before we go to the next slide. 2016, so we saw a big loss of the nearshore portion of the eelgrass bed, and that part of the bed is intertidal, so it's very shallow and completely exposed at low tide. My leading theory for this specific location is it's either an extreme weather event at low tide. So for example, during a low tide in the summer, it could be extreme heat, or in the wintertime at low tides, it could be extreme cold. Those are possibilities, but my leading theory is actually that it was herbivory from Canada geese, which have greatly increased in numbers and are actively feeding in that, especially in that intertidal shallow edge areas. And we've seen a strong correlation in other sites as well, where Canada geese show preference for hanging out and have increased in number. And we see a disappearance of that shallow portion of the eelgrass beds. So that's my leading theory. That's 2019. If you're interested in learning more about the impact of exotic herbivores, including both the fallow deer on Mayne Island and the Canada geese, sorry, Chazzy, I'm hijacking your event to promote one of our events. You can tune in on March 20. You can tune in on March 24th. Peter Arcese is going to talk both about deer and Canada geese, and as part of that presentation. So next, I'm going to talk about the mapping work that was done in the last 2 years in partnership with the Galiano Conservancy. As Chazzy mentioned, that was part of a bigger project that also included bull kelp monitoring, which involved other partner groups throughout the Southern Gulf Islands, as well as outreach. And that work was funded by Fisheries and Oceans Canada through the Habitat Stewardship Program. Our area of focus was the outer Gulf Islands, going up as far as Valdez Island, including Galiano, Mayne, North and South Pender, Saturna, and any of the little islets as well in between. Now, we only had resources to map the extent of a target of 20 sites. So we had to pick and choose which sites within that area we wanted to create data for. We had the amazing existing data set that Nikki talked about. That was from back in 2012 and 2013. That shows us where the eelgrass is, but it doesn't show the full shape of the bed. It was created with the drop camera being towed around the perimeter of the islands at a depth of 1 to 3 meters chart datum to detect yes or no whether that eelgrass was there. But this was an invaluable source of information for us to prioritize which sites to go back to and create the shape of them. And so we looked for areas of long linear lengths of shoreline that had the flat continuous beds that Nikki was talking about, those big dense ones. The idea was that we wanted to put on the map and get more information about the eelgrass beds that are most contributing to ecological function and carbon sequestration. And I would love to map every single bit of eelgrass within this area, but that's what we just had money to do a little bit. So we started with that. We ended up doing about 26 sites throughout these areas. And these are the sites that we actually ended up surveying. So you can see that there's 3 sites on Valdez, Shingle Point, Blackberry Point, and DeWeiler Bay, I guess you'd call it. We actually stayed camped up at Dionisio Park for 3 nights, and we tried to survey Coon Bay. We ran into problems with visibility and currents as well. It was a pretty tricky site to be doing free diving survey work up in Poirier Pass there, but we used that as a base of operations to go out to these different sites. We trained a crew while we were up there from the Galiano Conservancy who mapped Retreat Cove and a couple sites in and around Montague Harbor. I'm going to talk about all these sites and the methods we used in a little bit more detail. So our survey method, basically we're working in teams of 3. We have 1 kayaker and 2 free divers. We always work with 2 free divers in the water for safety reasons, and I'll mention that a little bit at the very end. But we work in teams of 3. I'm going to try one video, and if it's only 1 minute long, so if it's choppy, then we'll just have to deal with it. This was our survey crew from last year. That's Charlotte Matthews and Joël Lavigueur. It was a boat that's loaned to us from one of our community members here on Maine. We load the kayaks up on the back and transport to our site. Some of the mapping can be done right from the kayak, and especially in the shallow portion of the eelgrass beds. And if you can see the bottom, then you can accurately map right from the kayak, which can save a lot of time. The rest of the beds have to be done by free diving, which is a lot more labor intensive. So that was smooth for me, but I'm assuming that's because it was on my computer, probably a lot chunkier for a lot of you others. So thanks for your patience on those. So I want to go through 2 sites in detail to show you what we found. So this is a bay. I don't know the name of it. It's on kind of North Parker Island, just to the west of Montague Harbor. And this is the drop camera information that we had. And this site you can actually see from the air photo. A lot of these dark patches happen to be eelgrass. It's not always clear that that those are eelgrass. They could be ulva, they could be kelps. In this case, actually, you'll see as I put the data that we acquired up on here. So that's what we knew about the site when we got there. And this is what we knew about the site when we left. So we were able to take that linear data and flush it out to give a more accurate picture of what that eelgrass actually looked like in that site. And we recorded estimates of density as well for each of the different polygons. We recorded maximum and minimum depth so that those data features could be compared to future surveys. And we recorded video transects through the beds of varying lengths depending on the site to record a visual record of what those eelgrass beds look like at this time. I'm going to skip over this video just because it's a bit chunky. The other site I want to talk about is Blackberry Point. So that's what we knew going into the survey. It's this really cool, like flat sandy bench that kind of extends right to here, and this is where the eelgrass is growing along that edge.
Can I interrupt you for a minute? If this is the southern point on, if this is the southern point on Valdez, this is actually Cardale Point. Just to clarify, Blackberry Point is further up by Ruxton and Pallades. Just for kayakers, if you know, familiar with Blackberry.
Oh, really?
Point, this is not Blackberry Point. This is Cardale Point, the southernmost promontory on Valdez. But a beautiful spot. But just to clarify.
Oh, thanks, Chezzy. Yeah, you've created a whole bunch of work for me. Now I've been calling this Blackberry Point on all my stuff. So now I have to go back through and change all my data. but better to know. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, Cardale Point, which is, as Chezzy says, a beautiful spot and a great spot to, if you're looking for a location to do some recreational snorkeling or free diving. It's a great spot. It's a shallow sandy bench that goes out to the edge here, and then it's a steep drop off. And it's that drop off, that deeper water, that creates the limit of where the eelgrass will grow. Because like all plants, it relies on photosynthesis for energy, and it's that greater depth that limits that light penetration and limits the deep area to which that eelgrass can grow. And we put 2 transects in there. I'll give a shot on showing you the video from this transect, at least a clip from it. It's a 4-minute video. It's a 120-meter transect, but I've taken that video and I've cut it into 3 small pieces, so it's less than a minute long, and it just shows you the very beginning, the middle, and the end of that full transect. But it's a very extensive and very lush eelgrass bed here. So the kayaker tows the diver, who is tethered to the kayak and operating the camera, through the eelgrass, the diver takes a video looking down into the eelgrass, and this creates a visual record so that if there's a change in the future, it can be confirmed by looking back at these videos. We had great visibility on the days that we were surveying on the west side of Valdez. Often visibility can be the limiting factor on whether this type of survey is successful or not. So those were the sites that I just wanted to go through in detail to show you the methodology. I'm going to go through some slides now for the sites that we surveyed on Galiano, and then I'll show you just generally some of the other sites that we did as well. So we talked about Cardale Point. Shingle Point is even more extensive, especially in its length. So a very long, big eelgrass bed. We saw more diversity and fish at this site than anywhere else during any of our surveys. It was definitely the funnest survey day that we had. We also surveyed on Valdez Deweiler Bay. It's big, but it's not a very dense eelgrass bed in most parts. It's pretty sparse and deep. The Galiano team did Retreat Cove over a few days as their first survey site. And we surveyed a whole bunch of sites in and around Montague Harbor and Parker. And I'll talk about those. I'll just show those in a little bit more detail. We didn't do this edge here. So this was one that would have been just a little bit further down the list of priority sites that we didn't have time to get to. So maybe we'll be able to have the opportunity to survey the extent of eelgrass in southeast Montague Harbor in future years. So this one we talked about was that bay on the south side of that little hook that comes out on Parker Island. Really dense eelgrass bed, but kind of a bunch of small polygons. On the north side of Parker, it's phenomenal. You could almost walk across this eelgrass. It's so thick. And this is a very typical formation of eelgrass in that it's following that contour in these narrow sheltered bays. You often see this kind of horseshoe shape of the eelgrass where it extends up the sides. And you can easily map this edge by kayak. You can see right to the bottom on a reasonably clear water day. But this whole area here, you need a free diver to dive down to see the bottom. And I have a very short video of what that looks like from the kayak in the middle of this lush bed there. So this is that North Bay in Parker, and as you can see, it's just phenomenally dense and lush, nearing 100% cover in most places, with the exception of a couple spots. In 2019, we surveyed Shell Beach. This one has a portion where you can actually walk the eelgrass bed. It's so shallow here, it's intertidal, and it's totally exposed at the lowest tides. So you don't even need a kayak. You can just walk the edge of that bed with a GPS. So these surveys are really available to community groups, and there's no very low tech. The team from Galiano Conservancy also surveyed these two beds just off the point there in Montague Harbor, as well as these. I don't know the name of that little bay. I don't know if you know it, Jesse, or if it has a name, but it's kind of like North Montague Harbor.
Yeah, on the last slide, there's a Crescent Beach is one of those bays, but this one I don't know a specific name.
This one here is Crescent Beach.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a beautiful beach there.
Yeah.
Hopefully go camping there this summer, maybe late summer.
Nice.
We tried to do more mapping here in this area. So, Whaler Bay, Gossip Island, there's big eelgrass beds in Sturdy's Bay. The only area that we did able to survey was here in Murchison Cove. This area had really bad visibility throughout the summer. So we visited it a couple times, but visibility was always too poor to complete the survey. That's one that may have to be done, in the winter time by drop camera, for example. And yeah, there's the Murchison Cove one. Another area that has a lot of big eelgrass beds is North Pender Island. So this is Port Washington here. This is Otter Bay. So Port Washington has this big, long eelgrass bed that extends around the outside of that little islet there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Otter Bay. That was kind of a big surprise day for us. In 2019, we were there. And so this orange line here is what we knew about the site going in, right? That's where we knew the drop camera had detected eelgrass, and that's what we were going to look. And we had a hard time finding, there was nothing in here. And this bed here was kind of patchy. It wasn't really that substantial. It wasn't, as big as we had expected. We mapped these dense little patches over here. And then it wasn't until the end of the day, our boat was moored about here, and our dive team was swimming back to the boat, and they got over the top of this eelgrass bed, and they're like, "Whoa, hey, there's more eelgrass here." And so we came back the next day and ended up mapping this giant, huge eelgrass bed that we had no expectation was there. So that was a big surprise for us. The other big surprise was.
Rob, we tried doing a small restoration between to connect the gap there, and it's not succeeding. So it's interesting. Don't know why.
Yeah, we were thinking that too. We're like, why is there no eelgrass in this site? One thing we noticed was that because of the wave energy that comes in here, Nikki, the visibility, the water visibility was so much consistent. It was consistently poor on the days that we were there in the shallow area, but so it could be that this water it's deep enough and cloudy enough because of the sediments coming up that it prevents eelgrass. But that's just that was the only thing I could think of. The other big surprise was Breezy Bay on Saturna. So this is Saturna Beach here, and again, we had this line that we expected to find eelgrass in, and a little bit over here, but none of this was known. So there's a couple interesting things about this site in particular. One was just the sheer size of the eelgrass bed. It's not super dense through here, but there's a really dense outer edge on this side. And both sides are deep. So this site took us 4 days of surveys, and it was all big deep dives, 5 and 6 meters each time. And so we record these waypoints every 5 meters is our target interval. And so each diver is doing 3 dives at a time, and then they switch. And the other diver is their safety partner, keeping an eye on them from the surface while they recover their breath and allow their oxygen levels in their blood to go back to normal. So that was one surprise, just the sheer size of the bed and how long it took us to map it. The other surprise is that there's this big gap right here where you would expect to find eelgrass based on the substrate and depth and it being a sheltered bay. but there's really hardly anything in there. And so Nikki, you might find this interesting, my next slide. So literally about a month after we had mapped this site, someone posted a photo on the Saturna Island Facebook forum that may provide a clue to why there's a little gap there. So this is a picture taken in the 80s when the Saturna Lamb Barbecue, an annual event that was held there for, I don't know exactly, a long time, like 20 years or so. And you can see all the boats anchoring in there. And that's going to create, that repetitive impact is going to create a big damage to that eelgrass and could provide a theory as to why there's less eelgrass there than there should be. And so last couple sites I'll talk about, this is Winter Cove on North Saturna Island, and here's Samuel Island here. There's a beautiful bay here. This is Irish Bay, two big, huge eelgrass beds. Varuna Bay as well is full of a beautiful eelgrass bed. And this is where we ended. This is kind of where we ran out of time for the summer. We had started to map the eelgrass beds here along North Winter Cove. There's not a huge amount of eelgrass beds here. We had thought they might extend further out into the bay because it's quite shallow. But we started mapping a bed here, which is actually a lot thicker and denser. And we have partial data for this eelgrass bed here. This summer, our intention is to go back and finish both sides of Winter Cove as a priority for our surveys this year. So briefly, what this data has been used for. So the way in which I've seen it used over the last few years is minimizing damage from human development. So we've been consulted quite a bit. People have requested our data, which we provide freely to government organizations, academics, First Nations, anyone who asks, we give it to them for free. We've had our data requested by BC Hydro. They want to know how they can lay buried power cables into a bay while minimizing the impacts to the eelgrass, and we're happy to provide that data to them. It saves them from having to repeat these surveys. We get the data requested by people who are putting in docks and want to make sure that they avoid those features. Larger docks and infrastructure projects that are going in also need to make sure that they avoid eelgrass beds. We use the data to post publicly, like the map that Nikki showed you. We have maps, which I'll show you an example of in a second, that allow boaters to make informed decisions about where to anchor their boats. They show a map of where the eelgrass is and make a recommendation on the minimum anchoring depth. We use this data to detect change in extent over time and to help us understand the eelgrass's contribution to things like carbon sequestration and marine ecosystems, inform marine protected area planning. And we've been sharing our data with a group from the University of Victoria who are using it to assess the ability of drones to detect eelgrass as well. So it's been used as like a baseline kind of data to test new technologies. So this is an example of one of our, what we call our anchor out signs. So this sign is posted on Miners Bay Dock and shows boaters where the eelgrass is and encourages them to anchor out into deeper waters. I've been encouraging you guys to get out there and do your own snorkeling and free diving. I want to bring to attention a free online free diving safety course that I encourage you to look at. My good friend Lyle, who Nikki also knows, I was telling him about our eelgrass surveys and he on the phone during a conversation, and he brought up some safety concerns. He's big into the safety. He's a professional diver for the Coast Guard, and he put me onto this link, which is a phenomenal link. It talks about something called shallow water blackout, which is something that you should learn about before you get out there and start free diving. So I encourage you to follow that link or do a Google search for immersion free diving. Just on Friday, I finally received word that our geospatial data for both our eelgrass data and our kelp mapping data is available freely on what's called the Strait of Georgia Data Center. So for any of you that are in the industry and want access to that data, you can either email me or you can follow that link and go onto the Strait of Georgia Data Center, and it's all up there as of Friday. And finally, I just want to say how much I enjoyed our collaboration with the Galiano Conservancy over the last couple of years working on this project. This was our campsite office where we set up. This was when we were training the Galiano team on the survey method. And there's Joelle doing a fine job functioning as our hotspot antenna, ensuring that we have internet access. So thanks very much to all the members of the Galiano team. It's been a great time working with you guys.
Thank you,
That's
Rob.
it for me, Chezzy, if you have any questions.
Yeah, we do have a few questions. We have 5 minutes left, folks. We're trying to finish by 3:25, but I encourage you to stay with us to the end because some of these questions I think you'll find interesting. I'm just having to go back up. Anine Volkerman asked, could drones be used for mapping? There might have been some up above this, but if you can start with that question.
Yeah, so there's a couple different groups that have used drones well for mapping. I encourage you to do a Google search on the work that the Hakai Institute has done around Calvert Island. They've done some great work with drone mapping, as well as that might be for kelp. But yeah, drones have been used both for eelgrass and kelp mapping.
Great, and Kiara asked, she works with the Mabry on a forage fish project, wondering if you've ever compared forage fish spawn sites and abundance versus the studies you're doing on the reduction in size of these crucial eelgrass beds. And if you have you seen a direct negative correlation between the two? And so, Nikki, you may have more input on this, but either of you, Nikki or Rob.
Any comments, Rob?
No, as far as I know, like we certainly haven't done any work to show a correlation between, we don't have any data actually to assess forage fish breeding success. So we don't have the data that would allow us to make those connections. I don't know if Nikki's familiar with any other work that's been done to connect eelgrass change to forage fish breeding success.
You know, I love this question because I'm a systems person, and I think we should approach it with that point of view of forage fish and eelgrass and kelp and the forest and the riparian area and all the rest of it. I am looking with Ian Bruce from Peninsula Stream Society, a particular beach in Sydney. It's called Roberts Bay, and it has sand lance all year round, but it has a wall that's been there for 30 years. So I think if one were to start this, one would want to do something around retaining walls that have been in place or are about to be put in place, do a forage fish survey before and after that construction, or if a wall's been in place for a long time and a Green Shores solution is being put in place, and do forage fish sampling all during that project. I do know from Roberts Bay that the eelgrass has receded into deeper waters, most likely because of sediment coming from the beach, because of wave refraction, because of that wall. So if we could look at areas like that and start looking at the interconnections, I think it would be just incredible. I think it's a really good idea to put these two pieces together.
Thank you, Kara. And then the next question was from Raquel Farrow. Not knowing any shoreline water laws, can an island control traffic in and out and around? I assume this is in response to where boats are mooring, where they're allowed to moor, where they're not.
There are bloody few laws and policies, and there is some work by the West Coast Environmental Law in conjunction with CPAWS, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, to put in a shoreline protection policy that would lead to laws. BC is so far behind Washington State, but having said that, maybe local opinion and local education helps a lot, as well as this zoning that we're trying to put in, a voluntary no anchor zone. But we have a long way to go in protecting the nearshore ecosystems a long way as far as policy and laws.
Thank you, Nikki. And then the last question, I urge anyone, we have another minute to add questions here at the end, but another question was whether gaps in eelgrass beds might be naturally caused by swirling currents or back eddies in some bays beyond the usual rise and fall of tides.
I think what Rob was pointing out is change over time. I think that could very well be true in some places, but when you have those gaps appearing over time, it's more than a natural process. I think I'm saying the obvious. I don't know what's going on on Pender. I'm really curious about that. It could be where the waves break. Have you thought of that, Rob? Otter Bay, the waves come over the eelgrass bed, break between that barrier, and then come in a little bit more calmly so that eelgrass can grow near the shore. But hey, any research students out there, love to look at currents more often, tidal exchanges and wave velocities. That kind of stuff is vital to making site selections for restoration, as well as, looking at these changes over time. What's going on that we have these losses?
All right,
well, there's another one.
It's 3:30 now, so if anyone needs to leave, I understand. But if anyone has a last minute question, I think the speakers are probably willing to answer one or two more. But if there aren't any questions, I just want to extend a big thank you to Nikki and Rob for taking the time, and also to everyone who's tuned in. One of the nice things about COVID making us go virtual is we have people joining us from Kitimat and from Kitchener. And I know most of us are joining from the Southern Gulf Islands, primarily Galiano and Mayne. And I just want to recognize that we are in the asserted and unceded and shared territories of Hulkaminam and Senkuten speaking peoples. And we're grateful to be able to help protect eelgrass habitats and other important ecosystems in this area.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming.
A lot of fun. I'm looking at the chat room, seeing if I can get any more questions in.
And this presentation was recorded. So if you know of anyone who might be interested, we plan on posting it on the Galiano Conservancy YouTube channel in the coming days. And there will be another talk in this series next week on eco-gastronomy, completely different topic. As well as if you, Rob, you can do another shout out to your presentation that's coming on, or your talk coming up. It's on the 24th.
Yep, on the 24th, we've got Dr. Peter Arces from UBC Forestry Department, who's going to be talking about the impact of exotic herbivores on local ecosystems. So for Mayne Island, the two big ones we've got is the fallow deer and also the Canada geese that have some shocking history of government-funded purposeful introductions, what a lot of people don't know about.
Fascinating. Well, I definitely hope to tune in. And again, the Galiano Conservancy has another talk on March 14th, next Sunday at 2 o'clock, by a talk by John Volpe on the work being done by his eco-gastronomy lab. So thank you all for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.